The rift between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I is rooted in the Treaty of Tilsit, 1807. The agreement, concluded on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, had then sealed a temporary alliance, but the respective ambitions of the two sovereigns could not coexist for long. The continental blockade, decreed by Napoleon to suffocate British trade, demands all European nations break their trade with England. However, Russia, a vast agricultural and commercial empire, suffers economically from this forced closure. Gradually, Alexander III shows reluctance to strictly enforce the blockade, allowing English products to enter his lands, to Napoleon's great displeasure. Moreover, other sources of discord accumulate. Poland, now the Duchy of Warsaw under French protectorate, worries Russia, which fears the revival of a hostile Polish state on its western borders. Furthermore, failed matrimonial alliances fuel grievances. By 1811, the Tsar restricts the application of the blockade, almost officially announcing he will no longer accept Napoleonic hegemony. Bonaparte, in turn, considers this reversal as an affront. For him, a grand expedition into Russian territory is imperative. It is no longer just about exerting pressure on Alexander, but crushing him to permanently consolidate his empire. In June 1812, Napoleon gathered on the banks of the Niemen, the largest military force Europe had ever seen. It is estimated to consist of over 600,000 men, all corps included, about 450,000 French soldiers, supported by allied contingents, Austrians, Saxons, Bavarians, Westphalians, Poles, etc. This extraordinary grand army, divided into several army corps, followed a simple plan: cross the river, penetrate Russia, and deliver the decisive battle that would force Alexander I to negotiate. But Russia is vast, and the Russians practice a strategy of gradual retreat, avoiding frontal confrontation and applying the scorched earth policy. Villages are burned down or stripped of their goods, depriving the Grand Army of essential resources. The supply lines, already stretched over hundreds of kilometers, struggle to maintain food and forage supplies. Logistical difficulties quickly prove enormous. Every evening, thousands of horses die of hunger or exhaustion. The wounded and sick clog improvised field hospitals, and typhus begins to spread. Moreover, the sweltering heat of the Russian summer surprises the troops. Estimates vary, but it is considered that even before the first major battle, the Grand Army lost more than 100,000 men through desertion, disease, or simple exhaustion. Finally, the Russians accept battle at Borodino near the Moskva on September 7, 1812. General Kutuzov, appointed commander-in-chief of the Russian forces, awaits the Grand Army with around 120,000 men. Napoleon then lines up about 130,000 soldiers. The clash is of an unprecedented violence. The fortified Russian positions, notably the Ravsky and Bagration redoubts, fiercely resist the assaults of the French infantry and cavalry. The artillery on both sides creates carnage. Repeatedly, Napoleon hesitates to engage his Imperial Guard, fearing to lose this elite corps. He eventually wins the battle, forcing Kutuzov to retreat towards Moscow. Nevertheless, the victory comes at a high price. French losses are estimated at more than 30,000 men, many of whom are experienced officers, and the Russians lose at least as many, if not more. On a psychological level, Borodino is not a resounding triumph. It is a slaughterhouse that does not destroy the Russian will. Contrary to Napoleon's expectations, Alexander I does not ask for peace. Kutuzov, aware, understands that Russia can sacrifice soldiers and exchange space for time as winter is approaching. On September 14, 1812, Napoleon enters Moscow, the holy city of Russia and symbolic capital. although St. Petersburg is the administrative capital. However, the population has already evacuated. In a strange atmosphere, the Grand Army discovers an almost deserted city. Quickly, fires break out. Most are likely set by Russians, determined to prevent the invaders from finding shelter and provisions. The fire ravages the wooden quarters, spreading at an appalling speed. For several days, Moscow burns, making the occupation almost unbearable. Napoleon waits in vain for an envoy from the Tsar to negotiate peace. In vain. The Russians, at a safe distance, let the enemy become bogged down in a ruined city without supplies. The emperor has to face the facts. He cannot stay in Moscow indefinitely for lack of food for his men and horses. The first frosts already appear, heralding an early winter. After a month of immobility, he finally decides to retreat, hoping to reach more favorable territories where to establish his winter quarters. The retreat begins in October 1812, under extremely difficult conditions. Temperatures drop sharply, often below 20 degrees, sometimes 30 degrees, for which most soldiers of the Grande Armée are not equipped. Often, they only wear the light uniforms of the summer campaign. The horses, already weakened, die by the thousands. The Russians, on their part, harass the retreating column. The Cossacks multiply raids on the flanks, attacking isolated units. In the rearguard, Marshals Ney and Davout attempt to contain the assaults, but continually lose men, equipment, and cannons abandoned for lack of horses to pull them. The situation worsens further during the crossing of the Berezina at the end of November 1812. The bridges are destroyed by the Russians, and the river is half frozen. Napoleon orders his engineers to hastily build makeshift bridges under enemy fire. Thousands of soldiers and civilians are crammed on the banks in total panic. Many drown or freeze to death. Despite everything, a portion of the Grande Armée manages to cross the Berezina, but leaves behind a significant part of its baggage and its men. During this debacle, Napoleon is constantly seeking information on General Maillet's conspiracy in Paris, October 1812. He learns that a plot nearly overthrew his regime, taking advantage of rumors about his death in Russia. Fearing the fragility of his position, he decides to leave his army hastily on December 5, 1812, leaving command to the King of Naples, Joachim Murat. He travels incognito by sleigh to return to Paris as quickly as possible, arriving in mid-December. The contrast is striking between the capital, which has remained relatively calm, and the apocalyptic scene of the retreat, where survivors, chilled and demoralized, return to France in small, skeletal groups. Of the more than 600,000 men who set out, it is estimated that fewer than 100,000 return in combat-ready condition, a figure that includes soldiers wounded or ill to varying degrees. The catastrophe of Russia is a national trauma, shattering the myth of Napoleonic invincibility. Taking advantage of the French weakening, European powers regroup once again into a sixth coalition: United Kingdom, Russia, Prussia, and Sweden, joined by Austria in 1813, all determined to bring down Napoleon. Great Britain continues to finance this alliance, while Russian armies, invigorated by their defensive victory, march westward. Prussia, humiliated in 1806 at Jena, seeks to take its revenge. King Frederick William III encourages patriotic revolt, sparking a national movement to drive out the French. As for Austria, it eventually turns against its son-in-law Napoleon, seeing in his Russian defeat an opportunity to restore its own status in Europe. In the spring of 1813, Napoleon attempts to hastily rebuild a new army by decreeing massive levies of conscripts, sometimes only 17 or 18 years old, called the Mairie Louise. The lack of experienced officers is painfully felt, as many have perished or been taken prisoner in Russia. Unfortunately, even though Napoleon still achieves some successes, like at Lutzen, May 2, 1813, and Bautzen, May 20-21, 1813, he no longer has the same tactical superiority. The coalition armies learn from past mistakes, strive to coordinate their movements, and benefit from increasingly large numbers. A major turning point occurs from October 16th to 19th, 1813, in Leipzig, Saxony. Nicknamed the Battle of Nations, it pits more than 200,000 French and allies against about 300,000 soldiers of the coalition: Russians, Prussians, Austrians, Swedes. For 4 days, fierce combat rages around the city. Napoleon, lacking cavalry to protect his lines, suffers constant pressure from enemy waves. The King of Saxony, initially an ally of France, defects in the midst of the battle, joining the opposing camp. This betrayal hastens the debacle. The main bridge blows up before all French troops can retreat, trapping part of the army in the city. The losses are staggering, an estimated 100,000 dead or wounded on both sides. Leipzig seals the end of Napoleon's dominance in Germany. The states of the Confederation of the Rhine quickly detach themselves from the French Empire. The coalition forces march westward, crossing the Rhine at the end of 1813. France finds itself invaded for the first time since the Revolutionary Wars. Peace negotiations remain fruitless, as Napoleon refuses to return to the 1792 borders. He still wants to retain his influence in some annexed territories, but the enemy demands the dismantling of his empire. As the situation worsens, Napoleon sees more of his allies abandoning him. The kings placed on European thrones, even his own brothers, attempt to negotiate their continued power with the coalition, sacrificing their loyalty to the emperor to avoid the worst. The marshals themselves, exhausted by a decade of wars, begin to doubt the possibility of salvaging the situation. They have seen their best regiments decimated in Russia, at Leipzig, and know that French forces are now vastly outnumbered. Murat, King of Naples, secretly negotiates with Austria. Bernadotte, a former marshal of Napoleon who became heir to the Swedish throne, is now fighting with the coalition. Fouché, Minister of Police, maneuvers to secure a position in a future without Napoleon. The fatigue spreads throughout French society, which suffers under the unbearable burden of conscription and war taxes. In January 1814, the coalition armies cross the Rhine and penetrate French territory. Napoleon, despite his reduced forces, about 70,000 men against more than 200,000 for the coalition, conducts a brilliant defensive campaign, winning several unexpected victories through his mastery of maneuver and the speed of his light infantry. These successes, called the Campaign of France, further demonstrate the emperor's tactical genius, but are not enough to halt the enemy's advance. The coalition coordinates to converge on Paris, determined to force Napoleon into capitulation. On March 30th, 1814, the Battle of Paris begins. Marshals Mortier and Marmont try to defend the capital, but are overwhelmed by the Russian and Prussian numerical superiority. The next day, the city surrenders without being sacked, as the authorities prefer to avoid a massacre. Napoleon, then en route to rescue the capital, can only witness the surrender. The coalition occupies Paris, where Alexander Therms and Frederick William III make a noticeable entry. The Parisian people, exhausted by the wars, oscillate between resignation and curiosity towards these victorious sovereigns. Faced with the occupation of the capital, several marshals urge the emperor to negotiate. They persuade him that it is impossible to continue the war, as France itself no longer supports him in this endeavor. The coalition representatives indicate they will refuse any peace as long as Napoleon remains in power. On the night of April 4th, 1814, during a council assembled at Fontainebleau, the marshals and ministers demand his abdication. Napoleon, initially ready to continue the fight, finally gives in. On April 6, 1814, he abdicates in favor of his son, the Aiglon, Napoleon II, whom he had with Marie-Louise of Austria. But the coalition does not recognize this hereditary transfer and demands a total renunciation. Thus, on April 11, 1814, Napoleon signs the final act of his unconditional abdication. According to the terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau, Napoleon retains the title of emperor, but is limited to the island of Elba, a small Mediterranean island off the coast of Tuscany. He is granted an annual allowance, supposed to be paid by France, and a detachment of guards to ensure his protection. Accompanied by a few loyal supporters, he lands on the island in May 1814. Quickly, he organizes a reduced court. He sets up residences, creates a rudimentary administration, has roads paved, and gardens cultivated. Observers and diplomats present report that the former master of Europe is busy modernizing the island as if it were a new kingdom. At the same time, he follows the news from France, hoping for a change of situation. In Paris, the news of Napoleon's departure arouses mixed feelings. Relief among many families weary of wars. Concern among certain popular circles still attached to the imperial myth, joy among royalists, who see this abdication as the end of the revolution. The Allies restore the Bourbon dynasty in the person of Louis XVI, brother of Louis XVI, who was guillotined in 1793. The new king takes possession of the Tuileries and promises a constitutional regime. However, distrust towards this sovereign, who was exiled throughout the revolution, remains. The French, weary, accept a transition, but enthusiasm for the monarchical restoration remains limited, especially in the army where many regret past glories. Alert to political developments, he learns that the new regime, the restoration of the Bourbons under Louis XVI, disappoints or worries many French. Former military personnel sidelined, peasants fearing the return of tithes and privileges, empire supporters frustrated. Also informed of the quarrels between European powers, he senses that he can seize his chance by landing by surprise. On February 26, 1815, taking advantage of the relative leniency of the small French fleet supposed to monitor him, Napoleon discreetly boards a brig, l'Inconstant, accompanied by about 700 loyalists, grenadiers of the guard, officers, servants. Some auxiliary vessels complete the expedition, carrying equipment and ammunition. Evading the Royal Navy, he reaches the coast of Provence on March 1st at the Gulf of Juan, near Antibes. This choice is motivated by the geographical situation. The southern routes are less monitored, and the political climate in the region is considered more favorable, at least not as fiercely royalist as in Marseille or Toulon. As soon as he sets foot on mainland territory, Napoleon hoists the tricolor flag, a symbol of the revolution and the empire, and issues an impassioned proclamation to announce his return. The few local policemen exhibit surprise, even hesitation. The peasants, curious, recognize him by his gray coat and bicorn hat. News spreads rapidly. The emperor is back. The royal authorities react with incredulity, initially not believing the feasibility of such an escape. Louis XVI orders troops to block Napoleon, but events spin out of his control. Determined to reach the capital, Napoleon sets off through the Alps. The royal troops mobilize. The king dispatches the 5th Line Regiment, commanded by Colonel Labédoyère, to stop the usurper. But when Napoleon encounters these soldiers at Laffrey, on March 7th, a famous reversal occurs. The legend has it that he advances alone, opens his coat, and calls out to the troops, "Soldiers, if there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." Surprised and moved, the soldiers, instead of shooting, throw down their arms, and cheer for Napoleon. Lebedouillère unhesitatingly joins the imperial camp. This scene, considerably romanticized by propaganda, symbolizes the captivating power the eagle still holds over the French army, nurtured by memories of imperial glory. From then on, Napoleon's march towards Paris takes on the allure of a triumphal procession. The units sent to stop him successively rally, sometimes including officers still attached to the ideals of 1799, 1804, or nostalgic for victory campaigns. From villages cheering Napoleon to bewildered royalist officers, everyone realizes that Louis XVIII's regime is faltering due to a lack of popular support in the army. As he nears the capital, the number of soldiers and volunteers swells his ranks. The aristocratic elites and royal court, seized by panic, urge the king to flee. On the night of March 19 to 20, Louis XVIII leaves Paris hastily for Belgium. On March 20th, Napoleon enters the Tuileries amid an exultant crowd. The 100 days begin. As soon as he returned to Paris, Napoleon strove to restore the empire. He reinstated Napoleonic symbols, the tricolor flag, the imperial eagle, the Napoleonic Code. He published an additional act to the constitutions of the empire meant to give a more liberal color to the regime to appeal to public opinion. Press freedoms were partially relaxed, and he claimed to want to reconcile with all the forces of the country, but his room for maneuver was limited. Domestically, the memory of past wars tired more than a few, and the state's finances were depleted. Above all, the European monarchs gathered at the Congress of Vienna to redraw post-Napoleonic Europe, unequivocally condemned this unexpected return. They declared Napoleon outlawed and formed a new coalition to crush him. In fact, the Allied nations had never completely let their guard down. Austria, Russia, Prussia, and the United Kingdom maintained powerful armies ready to intervene if Napoleon once again upset the continent's balance. Tsar Alexander I, who once allied with Bonaparte, was uncompromising. Austria, whose Archduchess, Marie-Louise Napoleon had married, did not hesitate to consider this union void. Only Bavaria, once supported by Napoleon, adopted a more ambiguous attitude, but overall, the coalition reformed. Allied diplomats ended their differences to concentrate their efforts against the reborn emperor. Inside the country, the visible enthusiasm during the march from Gulf Juan to Paris did not translate everywhere into unconditional support. The peasants on one side feared a return to massive conscription. The business circles on the other dreaded the consequences of another war on commerce. The Republicans distrusted an imperial regime deemed authoritarian, despite promises of greater freedoms. Nevertheless, Napoleon managed to rally a considerable part of the French army. He committed to recalling former empire officers, rebuilding his imperial guard. He flattered patriotic sentiments, portraying Louis XVI as a ruler imposed by foreigners. The men remembered the great victories of the past, and the prospect of regaining national honor by defending the country against the coalition fueled a resurgence of fervor. In 3 months, Napoleon succeeded in assembling around 200,000 soldiers, far fewer than during the glory days, but still numerous enough to fight some crucial battles. He knew, however, that time was pressing, the coalition was organizing, and the summer of 1815 would be decisive. Aware of the need to strike quickly, Napoleon devised a bold plan to divide his adversaries before they could concentrate against him. The British armies, commanded by the Duke of Wellington, deployed in Belgium, while the Prussians, under Field Marshal Blücher, also approached this area. Napoleon decided to strike these two forces separately before their junction could be completed. He hoped to repeat the tactic of the Napoleonic battle, surprising his enemies, defeating them in successive engagements and then imposing his political will. In mid-June 1815, the French army crossed the Belgian border. The first confrontations took place at the battles of Ligny and Quatre Bras on June 16, 1815. At Ligny, Napoleon inflicted a serious defeat on the Prussians, forcing them to retreat. Meanwhile, Marshal Ney faced Wellington at Quatre Bras without achieving a decisive victory. The Prussians withdrew in disarray, but were not annihilated. Napoleon made the mistake of not pursuing them vigorously enough, relying on his lieutenant, Marshal Grouchy, to contain them. Meanwhile, Wellington fell back in good order to a strategic position south of Brussels, near the village of Waterloo. On the morning of June 18, 1815, Napoleon deployed his army facing Wellington's forces, solidly positioned on the Mont Saint-Jean plateau. The troops were roughly balanced, about 70,000 French soldiers against 68,000 Anglo-Dutch, supported by a Hanoverian German contingent. Most importantly, Wellington benefited from well-positioned artillery and terrain generally favorable to defense, slightly sloping, with fortified farms like La Haye-Sainte and Hougoumont. Napoleon hoped that Grouchy would keep the Prussians away from the battlefield, allowing him to defeat Wellington before any possible reinforcements arrived. However, the Emperor was unaware that Blücher, despite his defeat at Ligny, was resolutely marching toward Waterloo to aid Wellington. Weather played a decisive role. The day before, heavy rain had fallen on the region, turning the ground into muddy terrain. French cannons, less maneuverable in the mud, fired with difficulty, and the infantry advanced laboriously. Napoleon then delayed until late morning to let the ground dry, which gave Wellington precious hours to fortify further and, critically, brought the potential arrival of the Prussians closer. The battle seriously commenced in the early afternoon. The French attacked the farms of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, seeking to break through the enemy lines. The fighting was fierce. At Hougoumont, the British Guards and Allied troops held firm despite repeated assaults. At La Haye-Sainte, the legendary British infantry, renowned for its discipline and firepower, repelled several French waves. The muddy terrain limited the effectiveness of the French cavalry, commanded by Marshal Ney, who at one point ordered a massive charge without sufficient coordination. The cavalry charged against the Anglo-Dutch infantry formed in squares, suffering deadly fire. Despite their bravery, they were unable to break Wellington's defense. Meanwhile, Marshal Grouchy, who was supposed to prevent the arrival of the Prussians, failed to locate or intercept their march. Engaged in skirmishes near Wavre, he underestimated Blücher's speed and delayed moving toward the sounds of the Waterloo cannons. So, in the afternoon, the Prussian vanguard began appearing on the French right flank, sowing panic. Around 6 p.m., Napoleon finally sent his Imperial Guard in a desperate attack. This elite, the flower of the Imperial Army, charged up the plateau where Wellington stood, but the Guard, under heavy fire, started to falter. More and more Prussians appeared, threatening the French rear. The Imperial Guard retreated, an unusual event that shattered the morale of the entire army. Cries rose up. "The Guard is retreating. Every man for himself." French cohesion collapsed. Perceiving this critical moment, Wellington launched a general counterattack. The Imperial Guard, for its part, remained loyal to the end. When the Grenadiers' square was surrounded by the British and ordered to surrender, a French officer, often attributed to General Cambronne, reportedly uttered the famous line, "The Guard dies, but does not surrender." Several fractions of the Guard sacrificed themselves to cover the army's retreat, allowing Napoleon to escape the battlefield. He, disheartened, left Waterloo hastily, aware that he had just suffered an irreversible defeat. The defeat at Waterloo, combined with the threat of a massive arrival of coalition forces, definitively ruined the Napoleonic adventure. In the following days, Napoleon returned to Paris, still hoping to organize resistance. But the Chamber of Representatives, dominated by individuals seeking to spare France from another brutal occupation, demanded his abdication. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated a second time in favor of his son Napoleon II, whom history would call the Eaglet. However, as in 1814, foreign powers refused to recognize any successor. The ultra-royalists took advantage of the situation to bring back Louis XVI, who entered Paris on July 8, 1815. Napoleon, sought by the coalition, tried to find a ship to sail to America. But the British, who patrolled the Atlantic, compelled him to turn himself over at Rochefort. He still did not know the exact destination they had reserved for him. One thing was certain: they wanted to prevent any triumphant return. Napoleon, the former emperor, landed on St. Helena on October 15, 1815. This island, then administered by the British East India Company, is less than 20 kilometers long and around 10 kilometers wide. The black cliffs that encircle it, battered by constant winds, make any clandestine landing virtually impossible. The humid and changeable climate triggers fog and sudden showers, which affect Napoleon's health, already weakened. There is little vegetation, except for a few green valleys, and the rocky landscapes highlight the melancholic aspect of this exile. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, takes office in 1816. Strict and not inclined towards compassion, he imposes strict regulations. Napoleon must always be accompanied by a British officer during his walks, and he is forbidden to go more than 12 miles away from his residence, named Longwood House. Correspondences are controlled, and any potential visitor is monitored. The few ships that dock must adhere to a scrupulous protocol, preventing any escape conspiracies. This rigidity exacerbates the mistrust between Lowe and his illustrious prisoner. Longwood House, located on a windy plateau, is far from being a palace. The humidity is penetrating, the walls rapidly deteriorate, and the comfort is basic. Napoleon attempts to recreate a reduced court around him. A few generals, like Bertrand or Gourgaud, watch over him, while servants manage the provisions. The days pass with restricted walks in the garden, meals taken late, and animated discussions with companions. It all gives the impression of a slow monotony, reinforced by the headaches and stomach aches regularly suffered by the ex-emperor. To alleviate the boredom, Napoleon embarks on writing his memoirs. He dictates his memories to General Gourgaud and the Count of La Cassis, writing the famous Memoirs to serve as a history of France under Napoleon. He provides his own version of major events: Italian and Egyptian campaigns, imperial coronation, battles of Austerlitz and Waterloo. The writing sessions occupy long hours, punctuated by breaks for tea or meals. Through these narratives, Napoleon shapes his legend. He reinterprets the facts to his advantage, minimizing certain mistakes, like the Russian campaign, or accusing his marshals of treason. Detractors will say he manipulates history, while his supporters see it as the expression of a lucid mind, wanting to transmit his legacy to posterity. The companions in exile do not always agree, which fuels tensions. Gourgaud, for instance, eventually falls out with Las Cases. The intrigues of this small, confined circle reveal the difficulty of living in close quarters with a man once so powerful. Since 1819, Napoleon's health has alarmingly deteriorated. He complains of stomach pains and fever crises. The doctors disagree on the exact diagnosis. Some mention an ulcer, others suspect stomach cancer, an ailment that had already taken his father, Charles Bonaparte. The humid conditions of St. Helena don't help. In the spring of 1821, his condition worsens. Constant fever, vomiting, loss of appetite. On the morning of May 5th, he falls into unconsciousness and breathes his last shortly after 5 p.m. Witnesses report confused words, making reference to France, the army, and Josephine. The phrase, France, army, Josephine, is often cited as his final evocation of his shattered destiny. Whether exact or embellished, these words reflect Napoleon's deep attachment to the nation, the flag, and the companion of his early years of glory. Buried on May 9, 1821, in the Valley of the Geranium, since renamed Valley of the Tomb, the former emperor rests under a stone slab without a name in accordance with a last whim or a disagreement with the British authorities. A few French officers and English representatives attend the funeral in a sober and moving atmosphere. Subsequently, hypotheses on the exact cause of death multiply: cancer, arsenic poisoning, or simply the worsening of an untreated ulcer. The hair analyses conducted much later have perpetuated these controversies without resolving all doubts. Thus ends the epic of Napoleon Bonaparte, a figure both captivating and controversial, whose impact extends far beyond the mere chronology of his reign. Rising from the modest Corsican nobility to seize the imperial crown, he reshaped France and Europe through the power of the sword and reform, leaving behind a colossal legacy. His civil code, a true foundation of modern law, and his centralized administrative structures still form the backbone of many states today. Currently, more than 150 countries around the world apply a legal system inspired by the Napoleonic Code or its principles. His battles, from Austerlitz to Waterloo, resonate as symbols of unparalleled military genius, but also of the limits of ambition when it becomes excessive. After the definitive fall of Napoleon, the Bourbon monarchy, with Louis XVI and then Charles X, attempted to restore an old order, but failed to efface the reforms and modernity ushered in by the empire. Bonapartist ideas, fueled by nostalgia for military glory and centralization, remain alive in part of the public opinion. A few decades later, Napoleon III, the emperor's nephew, tapped into this flame to found the Second Empire, 1852-1870. Although becoming more liberal towards the end, this regime also eventually succumbed to the uncertainties of war. The Bonapartes, nonetheless, continue to feed a political movement and a myth that, over time, intersect with other ideologies in France amid monarchist temptations, republican surges, and desires for embodied authority. From this legacy, the country retains the imprint of a strong state, solid institutions, and a myth always ready to resurface when history seems to waver.